Ko ai au, ko tihe kera kura te maunga, ko waimaki te awa, ko miri te bei te turanga waiwai, no te tahi hau, ko Greg Takangoa. Kia ora, and it's great to be here today. Great to be able to be sitting on not the facilitation side, but on the sharing side, and great to see some familiar faces in the room there as well. I won't say old friends, otherwise we might have to have some sort of conversation later with some of us, but it's great to be able to be here and to connect with in this space. I'm just going to share my screen. And when I was asked to share around this topic, it's sort of like, and Judy said, you got to have a couple of 15-minute slots. It was almost like, well, what do you share and what do you not share? And so I've sort of tried to pull out what I've found in the last couple of years. I know some of you I've worked with many years ago, some more recently, but what I found worked really well, particularly into this leadership space, and then when we're working with colleagues and staff. And some of it will be aligning to what you know from the previous, you may have seen, but for some of it, yeah, we want to take it from a slightly different lens. And I suppose starting with this whole concept of kanuki to kanuhi, that whole idea of face-to-face, but I often think around this thought now of kanuki to kanuhi leads to wairoki to wairoa, and the face-to-face leads to heart-to-heart. And I think the challenge there is around how do we as leaders ensure, particularly in a pressured environment, particularly when there's so much Zoom and online stuff happening, how do we actually keep things face-to-face in those spaces and in that opportunity? And so with that in mind, just to set the scene, some of you may have read this book by Patrick Lencioni, by the 5 Dysfunctions of Teams. That's not what this workshop's about, but if you haven't read it, if you're interested in this sort of space or this sort of thinking, when the wheels go wobbly, then I'd highly recommend this to you look at this, because I think this sets the scene. I have to say I was given it, when I first was given it, I almost dismissed it because it felt like it was quite, had a lot of negativity bias in it. But actually, when you look at it for what it is, it became quite interesting. And as a leader leading a team, being able to be self-aware of yourself, but also those people around you. And Patrick, just to set a scene here for today, he makes this concept of these 5 dysfunctions, and almost systematically they move through them. He says, often in teams or as leaders, when we have a lack of trust, we fear conflict. When our teams fear conflict, we lack commitment. We lack commitment, we avoid accountability. When we avoid accountability, we have an inattention to results. And as I read that, I thought that's so true. And how often is that the case? Because that's looking at that, we flipped this on its head and looked at it from another lens. So I'm going to share this one with you now. Now, for those of you who want to write this down, feel free to write. The PowerPoint will be coming out to you afterwards, either soon afterwards or before tomorrow afternoon. So you will have a copy of the PowerPoint. So feel free, which works for you. But flicking it on its head, we adapted his thinking to go, if you can create whanaungatanga, that relational capital, and really make those connections strong, then we can actually have an ability to do conflict well and to almost have healthy conflict. And it's interesting because for some of us, conflict is a dirty word. Some of us, conflict is actually, we quite enjoy it. Some of us do everything we can possibly to ignore it, get rid of any sort of conflict in our lives. But I love the idea that Scott Peck talked around when he indicated the idea of saying, we often live in pseudo communities, and if we want to get to true community, we've got to go through that place of chaos. And I think it's similar to what Patrick was talking about here. When you go from having relational trust, it's not until you push through that you actually sometimes bump up against each other. And no doubt you and your leadership teams, in your teams you work with and run, you've bumped up against different personalities, different approaches, different traits that go on. But if we can have a conversation around how to do conflict well, I think we can actually become much stronger out of it. As we become stronger, we become committed to each other, committed to process, committed to the decisions we make, even if they're not what we all agree on, but they become mutually accountable, where I can keep you to account, but you can also keep me to account. And then we can actually then go, well, what's our core purpose and how do we get to that in those spaces? And I think often I'm working with schools and teams and leadership teams and kahiakos. What I've noticed is that actually we sometimes try and focus on accountability and results without ever approaching or broaching that idea around conflict and how do we do it and having those conversations. Because I found there's that old adage that no doubt your grandmother might have told you, that idea, a problem shared is a problem halved. And I think that's similar with conflict. When we actually can have a conversation about it before it blows up, it often never becomes what it could become if we don't in those spaces. And with that in mind, I came across this picture not so long ago, and I suppose looking at it, we see that and we go, well, what's causing that shadow? And as a leader, you'll go, it's pretty obvious. It's a rhombus, or it's a parallelogram. It's a squash square. It's some sort of shape with four sides, whatever level of depth you want to show. And that's true. That's what is giving that shadow. But if I was to put that there with you, what's causing that shadow? And again, you'd say, well, it's a sphere or an oblong, or it's a donut, or whatever it might be. And that's true too. But the question would be, what's the shape that's causing that shadow? Actually, it's a cylinder. And I suppose for myself, and what I found when working with leaders is actually in any sort of disconnect or conflict, is that often we become solidified in our own perspective or our own position, and not able to actually sometimes get out of our own shoes and to walk into another space and to be able to see it from another perspective. Because interestingly enough, both those perspectives are true, but neither is the truth. And I think that's a really interesting navigating tool to be able to go, how do I hold true what's true to you, but allow to go, how do we see it from another perspective, and what could be the truth that we see within this space? So there's one thought there that I sort of want to leave hanging with you. So it's thinking around, how do we do conflict in a positive way? And then also understanding that the perspective we see things from will dictate what we think's true, but just because it's true doesn't make it truth, which is going on. The other one is this concept here. And it's not just looking at him, but it's looking at that idea of what are the messages that we give in our school communities? What do we give as leaders? What do we give as teams we work with? And the whole idea of actually the messages on the back of that bus are both correct. It's a school bus and it's an anti-smoking campaign. But my challenge sometimes is with working with staff and leadership is that, do we sometimes mix those messages up? Sometimes because under pressure, sometimes because of stress, sometimes because we see things in a different way. And it comes to an idea that Flanagan made a statement a few years ago, where she says, if you're not modeling what you're saying something different. And I think it's interesting that as leaders, we can very easily say the nice stuff when things are going well, but actually it's not when things are going well that it counts. I think people are more importantly watching you when things don't go so well, and do you still model what you say in that space there. And so with that in mind, I just wanted to, sort of the framework I wanted to share with you was this idea of thinking around this whole, a lot of work I've done is in this restorative practice space or relational pedagogical space. And it leans a lot of work back into the work that Glasser developed back in the 60s and 70s. But I want to bring it today from a leadership space. And Glasser created this idea of social control window, social discipline window, and I know a number of you have seen this, but he basically said on that vertical axis, we've got structures, limits, or expectations. And across the bottom, he's got support, care, and concern. And he sort of split it up into four quadrants. And what he said was that actually, if I'm all about structures, limits, and boundaries, even as a leader, and I've limited on support, care, and concern, so I'm in that top left-hand area, it's often it can become quite confrontational. It can come a bit of win-lose. It can come a bit of hierarchical. It can become stigmatizing, and often is a place of where you share your thoughts, and often nothing comes back in that space. On the flip side, if I think right down that bottom right-hand quadrant, if I'm all about care, concern, monarchy, and not much about structures, boundaries, or expectations, I often can come into that place of being quite protective or rescuing, or actually want to pacify or minimize, or actually it's actually easy just to do it for you because I won't have the headache of having the conversation, and actually it'll be done properly. So why don't I just do it for you on your behalf? And then he talked about that idea as if I've got no structure, I've got very low on limits or kawa or tikanga, and very low on support and care. It's almost when I get into that place of being indifferent or lazy or given up and not even going to worry about that department or that senior leader or that parent in those spaces. But that idea on that flip side is he talks around, when you go to the top right, he thinks around that idea of if it's strong in boundaries and expectations and in support and care, when we can marry those things together. I was in a workshop recently where we talked about staunch with heart, when we can have high expectations, but with a lot of support to get there. So accountability with support, it can come to that place of becoming problem solving or respectful, collaborative in those spaces. And if I was to ask you, the conversation you've just had a moment ago in your breakout room around when things went wobbly, what worked, as Jude asked, just take a moment to reflect on that. Which box were you in, or which part of that quadrant were you in the way that you handled it, or the way that situation was handled? Because I could almost, I'll be quiet for a moment. I'll let you have a quick reflection on that for a minute. I could almost guarantee you that if it was done well and you walked away with and you felt your mana was intact and their mana was intact and it felt positive the way it went away, I could almost guarantee you were somewhere up here in that space. And whether I've done this with teachers or support staff or leaders or CEOs or whatever workplaces around across New Zealand and internationally, almost undeniably, people have said when things have been done well and it felt good, we've been in that top right box. And a guy called Whakaaro came up with this idea. He says the fundamental hypothesis of a relational or restorative approach is actually very simple, that human beings are happier, more productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And so a question for you, is that ring true for you? So thinking about that for a moment, the challenge would be, well, as leaders, I'm on this Leaders Connect, and of course I want to work with, high on boundaries, high on support. And I would be the same. I want to be in that space. In fact, I know on a good day, that's where I want to be. But I suppose my question to you, and in a moment we're going to do a bit of reflection on this, is to where do you default to? When you're tired, grumpy, and a bit worn out, when you're frustrated, it's the same staff members done the same thing, and that senior leader still hasn't got that report given back to you, or is that parent sending those 5-page emails to you, and you just can't be bothered because it's the first night you've gone home before 9 o'clock. Actually, where do you end up? Where do you default to? And interestingly enough, a question I often ask schools there is, where do you default to as a leader can often link to the way conflict was modeled to you between the ages of 5 and 10 years old. So going back to your own childhood, thinking how you had conflict modeled to you can often be a very similar connect to the way that we then default back into those same patterns now. A question to ask there is then thinking about that, to go, what happens if I end up in a particular space? Like I've been working recently with a senior leadership team, and I won't say where or what part of the country. Fantastic team. All of them, they're high flying, and on their day, they're in that top right box. But interestingly enough, when we started to unpack this, one colleague goes, well, actually, my default is up in that top left box. And you could almost see the principal said, oh, my default's at top left. And you could almost see the senior leaders go nodding, in that space. And what they also noticed is that one of the colleagues then said, well, actually, when things go bad for me, or when I feel tension, I'd go to try and almost be permissive and almost rescue or be undemanding or dismissive, and almost down in a permissive box or neglectful, just because it feels unsure and I don't particularly like that sort of space. And what became really interesting is that if you've got one default and another colleague's got another default, and we've never talked about it, it actually can become incredibly destructive for that relational culture that you develop within those spaces. And it was a really interesting conversation to have with the leadership team to go, where do you default to? And what triggers that default? What triggers you into that space? I was working with a leader just in the last 48 hours where when they feel confronted, you can see her go high, straight up to that punitive space. And it just shifts really quickly. On the flip side, I was talking to another colleague in the same meeting, and actually they very quickly dropped down into that permissive space. And you can almost see this game playing out in the room in front of us. And no doubt we've all seen that in different teams you've operated in. Because one of the joys is knowing where you want to operate, but then also knowing where you default to. You can then start to unpack what are the things that push you there. What are the things that will drive you into those spaces in that space? So in a moment, I'm going to ask you these questions and give you a chance to reflect on this into this space. Interestingly enough, I was talking to a colleague just recently. She's a CEO of a company and saying to me, oh, I've got a colleague I work with. She's fantastic, another colleague in the senior leadership team and in our team. And we just got into a Barney the other day. It got into a place where things started to fall apart, and it just didn't end well. And she says, I know it didn't end well. I know we've got the skills to deal with it, but I also know the fact that I could easily pass it under the carpet, and not deal with it. But she says our values as a company are about integrity, is about honesty, and about manaakitanga, and they've got these really strong values. She says, I can't actually be permissive and pass it under the carpet if I wanted to be true to our values as our organisation. And so the next comment to me was, which was really interesting, was, well, I want to have a restorative conversation with that person. But it came really interesting to go, so you want to have that, but where's that other staff member at? And what box are they coming from? And where are they positioned currently? And what are their needs in this space and going on there? And so in a moment, we're going to do a reflection. I'm going to ask you as a leader, not as a teacher, but as a leader, what box do you operate in? Another question I'm going to ask you, and so I'm just front loading those a moment, I'm going to ask you is, when things go wrong, where do you default to? And are you aware of them? And thirdly, what are those triggers? Is it when you're hungry or tired or worn out or let down or disappointed or minimalized? What is the thing that when your walls of your whare are starting to feel a bit cracked? What is the thing that pushes you to your default? And thirdly, and fourthly, how do you use this with your colleagues? How do you use this with your teams? Or how could this start a conversation for you in the way you operate? Because as you can see there's some big words written in red, when things are in the top left box, it's often my way or the highway done to you. The bottom right, it's often rescue and done for you. Bottom left, it's not done at all. Or the top right, it's the idea of done with you in those spaces. And the interesting thing is, as leaders, we can't always tell if we're working with someone unless we allow them to tell us if they feel they've been worked with. Because often we come from our perspective going, oh yeah, I'm doing all that. But actually, I was working with another group of senior leadership team and the middle leaders, and the senior leadership teams go, oh yeah, we've got a fantastic work culture, fantastic, brilliant. And I was wondering why none of the middle leaders were ever talking. And we'd throw questions out and we'd try and use all our facilitation processes to try and get conversation going. And none of them would say a thing. None of the middle leaders would say a thing whilst the senior leaders were in the room. However, as soon as the senior leaders left the room, I couldn't shut the middle leaders up. And it became really interesting that actually, whilst the senior leadership team felt they were working with them, they were very much, the peers felt it was all been done too. In fact, they were never really given a chance to have an authentic voice or conversation in that space. And so it became a really interesting conversation to be able to map out where we position ourselves and where we think we go and where others think we go in those spaces. So one last we thought on that idea is this idea here is that if you're not sure where you go, a way to think about that is, where do you spend most of your time? If you spend time as a leader telling people what to do, or hopefully not, yelling at people, the reality is you're in that top left. And I think what I've noticed in New Zealand, we've got a lot of really nice tellers, people who will tell what to do. But the problem with that is when I'm telling, there's no participation from the other side. The people we're working with is just, they're just passengers rather than participants. Likewise, we can often and very trickily fall into this answering box. I was working with another principal recently, and they asked some fantastic questions. But actually, when the team can't come up with an answer, they are very quick to give them some really good answers and really well thought out and fantastic answers. But unfortunately, by doing that, it actually shuts down the conversation, and there's always, they are in that for box. Now, sometimes the challenge is we just get into that ignore, and that's in the not. And it's the idea of an ability to ask well-crafted and well-honed questions. We're going to come back to that questioning a bit later on, because there's a real skill set in the ability to use pātai or questions in the way we have conversations. And I'll share one other quick story. I was interested. I was in a conversation with a principal recently in a school in the country, and we were having this conversation around how could you use this with your team, with your senior leadership team. So he's only talking about 3 or 4 staff, and it was interesting to go. He was wanted them to do it with each other, but he didn't want to do it with them himself. And so it became really interesting to know that he wanted to be able to call his colleagues on things, but he wasn't wanting his colleagues to be able to call him on aspects. And it became my challenge, my question to him, my invitation, my provocation to him was, in what way are you building a relational culture that's authentic when it's coming from that balance? And it became an interesting conversation. It was a challenging one, but as Brené Brown says, it was one of those courageous, brave conversations you've got to have. And actually, through that, we were able to positively work through that to be able to, how do we actually have that? What would that look like for you? And when would you be ready for those sorts of spaces? Now, the whole thinking around being in the asking space, I think is a really important thing. And some of us naturally ask good questions, and others of us, we need to refocus the way we use statements and the way we ask questions. And my colleague Rich and I have sort of come up with a bit of an idea a while ago, which is the whole thing around the power of asking, or the power of partai. And we call it friends and frenemies as a bit of a joke, but it's got a real meaning to that as well, because what we're sort of saying there is when we're asking questions, there's things that will help you out, and there's things that can bite you in, you know where. And that's the difference with a friend will almost always have your back, where a frenemy can sometimes catch you out, and often can be what can trigger you back into a default space. And the idea there is thinking is that when we're asking questions, they need to be open. Friends will be questions that are open, that allow more than a yes/no answer. The other classic in this space here is actually the whole ability to be authentic and curious, the ability to have a level of a curiosity in the way we're asking in our spaces. And a piece of work I picked up with a colleague recently was the acronym TVC. There's acronyms everywhere, but I loved it in that sense of when I'm mindful of my tone, mindful of my volume, and mindful of the cadence, it becomes massively impacting on the way that I ask questions in that space. And then jumping on from there is having questions that start with what, who, how, where, and when. Frenemies on the flip side have when they have closed questions, when it comes across with a yes, no, or a binary response, and that often comes into a level of accusational aspect. And they are those questions that often start with a space of why, or can you, or tell me, or are. And actually, I've been noticing with a lot of staff I'm working with lately is how quickly we fall back into frenemies in our conversations. And by doing that, we fall back into our defaults, whether that's answering for people or whether that's in the other space of the whole idea of being into a space of telling them in those ideas. So thinking around when we're coming across situations, Rich and I, a number of years ago now, developed this idea on the restorative keystones, or we could actually shift that to be conversational keystones. And this is what we use as both a planning tool and a reflective tool. And as a planning tool, we can actually map our conversations out. And the idea of it is such that in any conversation, no matter who it is with staff, with parents, with young people, there needs to be a level of preparation. There needs to be a level of what's going on and who's impacted, or what's happening, or how am I going to run this. There needs to be a level of participation, or a level of dialogical approach where both parties have a chance to be able to speak and share. And there also needs to be a level of follow-up in that space. And the reason it's in an archway is quite simple, in the sense that if I don't prepare well, or if I'm not in a good space, it's like a crack appears. Or if the person that I'm having the conversation with doesn't know why we're even having the conversation, or I haven't really worked out what the core issue was, or the venue I'm in is not conducive to a meeting, it's like cracks appear. And if too many cracks appear, the whole chalk starts to fall out. And if that chalk falls out, no matter what I do after that, the whole thing can fall apart. Similarly, let me get rid of that. Similarly, I can actually get into the space here where if I'm jump into the conversation and I'm in the nice asking space, but then I start telling a wee bit, or coming up the answer, or not leaving the space, or the person doesn't really understand where we're going. It's like cracks appear in that participation phase, and people will shut down or pull back from the conversation. And again, if it falls out, the whole doesn't matter what I do before or afterwards, the whole thing falls apart. And likewise, on the far end, the follow-up phase, the idea there is that if I'm in this follow-up phase here, I've just lost my cursor. It's like a crack appears if I don't actually follow through. I've had a conversation with a colleague, things haven't gone so well, and if I don't actually follow up what the outcome was, it doesn't matter what we've said in the meeting, is actually we don't follow through on that. It's like we're almost not honouring the conversation or the time where they've shared in that space. And if I was to ask you to think for a moment back to that conversation you said at the start of the day, when things have gone really well, I would almost guarantee you, whether you consciously or subconsciously, that all those three phases were there. And on the flip side, the question I would then have would be, if it doesn't go so well, where were the cracks in the conversation? Was it cracks in that we never followed up? Was it cracks in that actually that we got into a bit of a talk fest in the conversation? Or was it that we actually never even had the conversation in the first place? I alluded to a moment ago a colleague I'm working with, who the CEO of a company, and things didn't go well with a colleague, and this colleague's already decided they want to have a restorative conversation. My question is, what's the preparation we need to do before that? And is that person even aware of what the issue we've got is, or what is the issue we need to be dealing with? And so what we did from here is we actually took that to the next space. What we actually did in that space there was actually broke it down, and this became a planning tool. The planning tool is an idea, and again, this will come out to you, is an ability to go, what is the issue we're really dealing with? We're based on that idea around kanohi to kanohi, and we're going, okay, so what is the core issue? Who are the people that need to be in the room? Who are the people that need to be involved? Who needs to be consulted or discussed with? What's the best format? You know, who's best to facilitate? Who's best to run? How do I actually, what's the structure we need for this conversation in this space? How do I actually run the process? You know, whether it's a restorative conversation or like Viviane Robinson's Open to Learn conversations, you know, what's the process I use in that space? How do we come to an agreed upon outcome in that idea? And then what's the follow-up we need to put in place after that to ensure whatever we agreed upon actually can be followed through and followed up? And then finally coming to the feedback around going, how was that, and how was your mana maintained within that space, or was it in that space? And then creating the feedback in that idea. And I've got a whole lot of question starters, which I'm not going to bounce through or share now, but they'll be in the PowerPoint with you. But there are a whole lot of ways or prompts to think about in each of those aspects. So as we draw to a close, my encouragement to you, or my thought to you here, is how in your conversations, and Jude's going to set this up in a moment, is in your conversations you have with your team, how could this archway be used as both a reflection tool when things have gone well or not so well, as in where were the cracks, but also to ensure we have fidelity of our conversations, how do we use it as a planning tool to ensure I don't miss steps and leave things to the side, and therefore by leaving it to the side cause cracks to appear. So hopefully that's a useful tool that you can pick up, utilize, use. Feel free, there's our details are on the last slide, which has a whakatauki on it, which I share with you now, which is Manaki Tieti Tangata Aha Kōko Wai Aha Kōno Here, which loosely translates to treat people respectfully no matter who they are and where they come from. And what I feel with this restorative matrix, or the social discipline window in this archway, are two fantastic tools to be able to read ourselves, understand ourselves, but also to be able to look at practice and to be able to plan our conversations that we have to ensure fidelity in our space. Kia ora.